Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for our weekly Hanauma Talks seminar series presented by the Hawaii Sea Grants Hanaumo Bay Education Program. My name is Nunulu I, and I am the Outreach Program Coordinator for the Education Program. First off, I'd like to introduce Malia Evans, who is the Education and Native Hawaiian Outreach Associate, as well as Kamalani Johnson, who is the Hawaiian Language Curriculum Specialist, and they will be introducing our two speakers for tonight. A few reminders before they introduce our speakers and talk a little bit about their organization. Please keep all your questions till the end of the talk for a question and answer session, as well as, or please type them in the chat room at any time, and hopefully we can get to them throughout the talks. Also, please remember to turn off your microphone as well as your video function to allow a smoother presentation. With that, Malia or Kamalani, would you please talk a little bit about your organizations as well as introducing our two featured speakers for tonight?
Mahalo, Gavin. So aloha mai kako, and mahalo for joining us this month as we celebrate Mahina Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian Language Month. We have many people joining us from different parts of the world and from Hawaii, so please add your name and the place that you are joining us from in the chat. Mahalo nui. This lecture series is possible through the amazing collaboration and partnerships between the Hanauma Bay Education Program, the NOAA Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, and Halekua Mo'o Hawaiian Language Center at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. The talks you'll hear throughout February will highlight the importance of historical Hawaiian language literature and the innovative applications of Olelo Hawaii to ma'alama the natural and cultural resources of Papahanaumokuakea and Hawaii nei. Our kokua today with our webinar series, well, actually this month, we're going to have everybody introduce themselves. So, Kamalani.
Aloha nui kako, o Volkea o Kamalani Johnson, he kamau no ka hanau ahu, a he laikai ho'omohala ha'awina makahale kua mo'o. Aloha nui, my name is Kamalani Johnson. I'm from Kahanau Ahu, and I'm a curriculum specialist, Hawaii language curriculum specialist at the Hale Kua Mo'o at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. Aloha.
Kalani.
Aloha mai kako, ua no o kalani ki oto no hilo mai au, no wau ma hilo ki kahi, ua no kalai kahi no ke kia ho'omana'o ke kai opuni o Papahanaumokuakea no ke Papahana Oiwi Hawaii. Aloha mai kako, my name is Kalani Kiocho. I come from Hilo. I also live here in Hilo. I serve as the Native Hawaiian Program Specialist for Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument and World Heritage Site. Aloha mai kako.
Jenny.
Aloha mai kako o Jenny Crawford ko inoa. Noho wau ma Nanakuli. Aloha everybody, I'm Jenny Crawford. I'm from Nanakuli on the island of Oahu. I am the education specialist. I work alongside Kalani and Malia for Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. Aloha.
Aloha mai kako. O Malia Kalama Evans ko inoa no hilo mai au. I work in education and Native Hawaiian outreach with Papahanaumokuakea. So welcome to all of you. Mahalo to all the supporters of Hawaiian language. E ola ka olelo Hawaii.
Okay. Aia o Papahanaumokuakea, I waena o ka paki pika a kau, makahi o ka ekolu kaukani mile, mai ka aina puni ole kokoke loa, o ia ka paimoku ku ka awale loa o ka honua nei. Mamuli o ia ku ka awale loa ana I liliu e vea I nā mea kanu a me nā holoholona kukahi he nui. Wa nui nā lahulu a paa kuma o Hawaii nei I loko o ke kia ho'omana'o, a o heo nā like ma ke kahi aina. Wa nui no ho'i nā kahua mo'o meheu kahiko a me nā moku piholo a ho'ailona a ina kahiko.
Located in the central North Pacific, roughly 3,000 miles from the nearest continental landmass, Papahanaumokuakea is part of one of the remotest archipelagos in the world. This isolation has led to the evolution of many unique plants and animals. A significant amount of species within the monument are endemic to Hawaii, found nowhere else on Earth. This area is also rich in ancient cultural sites and historic shipwrecks and landmarks.
Okay, kia ho'o mana'o kaiau puni o Papahanaumokuakea kekahi o nā wahi maluo nui loa ke ao I ho'opalekana piha ia. Makahi o ka eono haneli kaukani o na mile kuea ma ka moana Pakipika, ua ane elike ka nui me ko ke kaiku'ono o Mekiko.
Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument and World Heritage Site is one of the largest fully protected conservation areas in the world. It encompasses nearly 600,000 square miles of the Pacific Ocean, an area nearly the size of the Gulf of Mexico.
O kele like ia, ke kia ho'o mana'o e ka eha hoa kahu vaivai. Ke ena oihana kalepa ma o ka papaluna ho'o kele moana a lewa puni au puni, ka oihana kuloko Amerika ma o ka oihana ia me ka holoholo na lohi o Amerika, ka moku aina o Hawaiʻi ma o ka oihana o na aina me na kumu vaivai kulohelohe, a me ke ena kuleana Hawaiʻi o ia no ho'i o Oha.
The monument is administered jointly by 4 co-trustees: the Department of Commerce through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Office of National Marine Sanctuaries and National Marine Fisheries Service, Pacific Islands Regional Office, the Department of the Interior through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Pacific Region National Wildlife Refuge System, and Pacific Islands Fish and Wildlife Office, the State of Hawaii through the Department of Lands and Natural Resources, Division of Aquatic Resources, and Division of Forestry and Wildlife, and the Office of Hawaiian Affairs.
O kele like ua mau hoa kahu vaivai la I ke kia ho'o mana'o e ho'o malu ai na kaiaula mai na piko mau na mokupuni I na apapa kai kohola I ke kai hohonu. A me na kumu vaivai mo o meheu ea e o ke kia ho'o mana'o.
These co-trustees together manage the monument to protect ecosystems ranging from terrestrial island peaks to shallow reefs to the deep sea, as well as other cultural resources within the monument. We're also happy to share that Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument will be celebrating its 15th anniversary on June 15, 2021, and we'll have more to share later. But let's get into tonight's presentation, and I'll turn it over to Kamalani to introduce our Manawa Hine, our speakers this evening.
No leila, o keia ho'ike I kapa ia o Nunulu I, Perpetuating Hawaiian Naming Practices in Papahanaumokuakea. The Hawaiian nomenclature process is an ancestral practice that shares similarities with Western science nomenclature. With a high rate of endemism and speciation occurring in the Hawaiian Islands, developing new Hawaiian names for recently discovered biological species in Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument is a key step to supporting a Hawaiian worldview. The Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument Native Hawaiian Cultural Working Group is comprised of community members, cultural practitioners, language experts, and researchers. It's an advisory group whose nomenclature subcommittee is honored to perpetuate the cultural practice of naming with a focused effort on providing names for species and features within the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. As best as possible, the aim is to develop a name informed by profoundly interconnected environmental kinship, as well as to ensure the names given are consistent with the traditional ecological knowledge and genealogy of our homeland, Hawaii. And so Hoku okahalelani Pihana is a native Hawaiian mother, ocean steward, and wahine wa'a. She was born in Wahiawa, Oahu, and raised in Long Beach, California. In 2015, she created the Nava'a Marine Stewardship Program that uses outrigger canoes to care for our oceans and support the next generation of ocean stewards. Hoku's love for the ocean and wa'a connects her to her papa. Her love for the aina connects her to her mama, and her love for the pai aina o Hawaii connects her to her children. Aloha nui e Hoku. Hoku Cody, born and raised in Hawaii, has bachelor's degrees in digital graphics and new media, as well as marine science. Since 2013, she has spent several seasonal field camps throughout Papahanaumokuakea, is a board member of the Kiriato Conservancy, as well as a member of the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands Cultural Working Group. Since doing fieldwork, she focuses on weaving together traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge to create adaptive habitat restoration frameworks in seabird conservation. Aloha nui e hoku.
Aloha, mahalo e kamalani.
Aloha, mahalo for having us.
So aloha mai kako. Mahalo nui for joining us this evening to learn more about the Native Hawaiian Cultural Working Group and our Nomenclature subcommittee and naming process.
Join the meeting.
Oh, we have so many more joining the meeting. Tonight, Hoku and I are going to share with you about the creation of the Nomenclature subcommittee and our naming process, as well as introduce you to the species we've named using this method. So mahalo nui for taking the time, spending the time with us, and we look forward to sharing all of this ike with you. Okay, Jenny, next slide. So to begin with, I would like to introduce the name Papahanaumokuakea to you. This name was given to our Kupuna Islands, and Tipua Kanahele, along with others, submitted her name selection when the monument was created. Her submission was the name selected for the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and we now know them as Papahanaumokuakea. In Native Hawaiian worldview, Papahanaumokuakea is the realm of Po, our ancestors, and is considered the source of our genealogy. It is where we come from, it's where our children come from, and it's where we go when we pass. Papahanaumokuakea is where our kupuna reside and where we make our spiritual transition to aumakua for our family and our descendants. This name embodies our genealogy, our family connection, and our relationship to our islands. This exemplifies what's carried and given in a name. Thus, for our nomenclature group subcommittee, there's a lot of intention behind this practice because Papa is so important to all of us, and we want to give our best to the wahi and our kupuna. Next one. This slide is shared in our opening presentation, reflects the relationship between our community and agency partners that supports the Native Hawaiian Cultural Working Group and Nomenclature Subcommittee. These partnerships help strengthen our efforts to perpetuate these practices and the practices of our ancestors through this naming process. Okay, the next slide. So these two images here reflect the mo'okuauhau of the Cultural Working Group that has been in existence for decades. The Nomenclature Subcommittee started roughly in 2012. Prior to that, our naming process was grounded in a more organic means, with land managers taking initiatives to reach out to individual practitioners and our ku'ula cohorts and such for different names of places and so on. All of these instances informed the process that we have today, but these images reflect the genealogy and the relationships that come into this naming process. Over the years, different options of how we've proceeded have manifested with the intention to expedite this particular part of the naming process and create those relationships and perpetuate them throughout generations. So the overarching intent or goal of the Nomenclature Subcommittee is to continue to push the agenda regarding reclaiming our spaces, building and strengthening and continuing relationships with these elements and species within these spaces. We aim to share perspective from other traditions. We understand that names and places, as well as relationships to those elements and species, evolve over time. So for us, this is an attempt to define and articulate a collective present day relationship as placeholders for future generations. Okay, next slide, please. So this particular slide reflects the initial naming process that kind of led into the naming process that we use today. This naming process displayed here was created by the Wahipana Place Names group of the 2012 Ku'ula cohort hosted by the University of Hawaii. We were able to go to Pihana, Midway Atoll, and conduct research implementing this methodology. We recognize that as we engage with place, we're building a relationship with that place. And through that, we develop a passion for that place, that space. Through engaging all of our 6 senses, our 5 physical, as well as our piko na'au sense, that one, that guttural one that kind of fattens all of the rest of the senses. Through this relationship, names were evoked. We also examined traditional noi'i. It was an important part of the process once names were evoked to learn more of the place and the suggested names we were thinking of. Finally, we would examine scientific literature and conduct research. Collectively, this practice contributed to the creation of place names. This process guided our naming practice that was part of the initial development of the naming practice that we use today. Next slide. So these are some examples of the names we gave using this practice. The first example is Ha'ena. This particular place in Pihana and Midway Atoll was named in 2000 by the 2019 Ku'ula cohort, and it was named Kukai Hau, translating into rusty bucket, and it reflected all of the debris that gathered in that space. When the 2012 Vahipana group came back to this space, we saw beyond the Kukai Hau, and we saw the Ha'ena that evoked, that came to light in this particular space, and how it reflected in the red colors, and also how it connected to the ha'enas that are seen throughout the main Hawaiian islands. So it was thought to, throughout our process and conversations and thinking, that to give ha'ena, this space, the name ha'ena, and Kukai Hau is still one used, but this was one that we thought would be useful to change and make anew. So Kayanai, the second image here below, Kalamai, that's my dog. Kayanai was a new name given, and it reflected the connection to Waianae Oahu, who someone who was part of our 2012 cohort, was part of creating this name. We recognized right here within the shorelines by this rock here, there was an incredible abundance of anai that would just gather and feed and gather and feed. And we gave Kai, rather than Vai, the name to kind of identify the differences, yet the similarities in relationship to those behaviors and occurrences that we were seeing in Pihimanu, as well as what we would see in Waianae Oahu. So these were some of the examples that came out of the process of this naming. And so from that, and as we moved into how we name today, this was kind of one of the initial developments of how we created names and started initiating conversations and looking deep into this process that we now use today. So now, as we transition to the next slide, so this particular slide reflects the process that we've developed over time from that initial one that I just shared and gave examples of. And it shows these different things that we look at. So the naming process itself and the naming rubrics that we use to help analyze names. And so from here, what I'm going to do is go ahead and transition over to Hoku, and she's going to share more about this particular naming process that we developed and the names that we've given using these methods. Mahalo nui for your time. Next slide.
Oh no, stay on that
side. Stay on the side.
Mahalo Hoku. Mahalo, aloha. So as Hoku was saying, over the years, you know, we had guiding ideas, and over time, you know, we've developed these guiding values onto a living document that would kind of set the arena for a meaningful discussion around crafting a functional name for each of these species. This is important because we're trying to expedite it a little bit because of, you know, to officially name something, put it in official writing, that itself takes some time too. So we gather everybody, and everybody, you know, comes with a diverse amount of experiences with the group. And so usually when we get together like that, that would naturally present a diverse selection of proposed names. And because of those differences in experiences and practices, we don't really have to come from the same understanding of the world around us, and we don't have to agree upon the category in which we offer up the name from. This process really just asks each person to profoundly reflect and dig into each of their own experiences and ike to turn out a name. Each person would propose a name and the reasons why they felt that would be a great idea. Then that particular name is discussed amongst the group from that person's perspective. This is where, you know, the naming rubrics comes back into play again. You know, we bounce it off each other. We see how it sounds. We see how it, you know, if it makes sense. And really, it is in this discussion that really shapes the names that we propose out to those managers and researchers. And there's instances where the subcommittee cannot unify under a proposed name. And that's when we present that name. You know, we'll come down to like one or two or three names, and then we'll present that to the broader cultural working group for more input and guidance. We really do this knowing that the relationship and understanding of the species can grow over time. And so therefore the name may change, which is a good thing because it'll reflect a maturing of our understanding of the species as well. And through this process since 2012, there have been about like 13 species and about similar number in birds as well as limu that we've used this process for, as well as a handful of geological features. But really in these next few slides, we're just gonna highlight a few species to display some of the ways in which we've landed and crafted these names. Next slide, please. We start with these, this slide here with the lemus, some of the lemus we just recently talked about. In these instances, we really relied on trying to find a lot of understanding about the place and where they're from in order to inform how we made these names. And really we wanted to show these limu, even though they're unpublished just yet, because we wanted to show that there's 3 limus on this slide here. And we really wanted to show that, you know, sometimes we're really just given one picture or, you know, we just go off a lot of just very little information. And sometimes that's due to circumstances because, you know, the researcher is diving in a remote area. And so what we really try to do is build context around these particular species when we don't have that information about the behavior or the growth or whatnot. As you can see, there's sometimes just really small specimens. And in this instance with the lemus, we were able to have the researcher Farissa as well as Randy Kosaki, who's an amazing lead researcher at NOAA, to kind of join us in this particular discussion. So they really played a big hand in providing a lot of our understanding. You know, and in the end, we were still able to find a name that set it apart functionally and have a meaningful name that reinforced its genealogy to the place that was found. Next slide. This one, we're mostly covering how growth stages play an important part in distinguishing, to distinguish, especially in instances where cultural practices require that level of specificity. And sometimes, you know, and specificity in practice can reflect an intimate understanding of the environment that which you're living within. You know, like ulua and papio, sometimes you have to have that difference. So for here, we wanted to, with the short tail albatross, there's only a few instances of them, but they do look a lot like the kaupu, Blackfoot albatross, as you can see in the second photo from the left. And as well as when they're older, they kind of can reflect a mole. And because of the kaupu and mole's importance in Makahiki, we really felt that this species was a candidate to get 2 different names. Next slide, please. So this one, if you can hold on off on the video for a second. This one we're covering Akihike'ehi'ale and Ahu'ava, because these names, we really didn't do too much crafting of these names. These were really kind of found, or we really relied on understanding the role and function of these, especially for the Ahu'ava kua, the function of it. But for the Akihike'ehi'ale, we really, you know, that one was, we had an old Hawaiian text with no English name, and then there was a lot of understanding in the science world about petrels, and so there was a little bit here and a little bit there, and so we had experts just kind of coming together and piecing this together. And this particular species, there's not a lot of info on, so we had to look for a close relative to find this particular behavior we were looking for, because the name itself, the old name that we did find, it kind of literally means a bird that's treading on water. And so we went and looked at its, you know, cousin counterpart. And if you could just play the video just real quickly, you know, just to kind of confirm what we were seeing and what we were reading about. We had cultural practitioners, we had bird experts and whatnot in the room. And we're all just kind of like forming these names. We had a few other names on the table, but once we saw this video and we looked at all the stuff that we had out there, and knowing that this was the cousin of it, just seeing how it bounced like that, we were like, okay, there's no doubt this is the name. So we really felt like we didn't have to work too hard in terms of crafting a name. And the same goes for the ahu'awakua. We just put the kua at the end because we wanted to delineate that this particular species came from the Kupuna Islands, as opposed to the main Hawaiian Islands with the ahu'awakua. Otherwise, other than that, if you look at the two plants, they look exactly the same and their function is the same. Next slide. So a lot of these species, a lot of them have common names or science names, and then they have that like lost Hawaiian names. And so a lot of these instances we're trying to, you know, craft the Hawaiian name from what's left or what we have around us. And so, you know, this one we really wanted to highlight these two because we really leaned on their behavior characteristics. We did a little bit of crafting and we did a little bit of gathering info. You know, for Hinoku, we really, you know, there was some really important characteristics that stuck out that was really Hina in nature. Both the gray color as well as its function, you know, the way it foraged closer to shorelines as opposed to the rest of its, you know, manuoku and other tern cousins and family members. So with that, we really, you know, we had a few other names, but we couldn't land on more. We couldn't figure out between these two names which ones we wanted to keep. So we kept them both because we felt like they both actually maintained its function and genealogy within its family. Whereas the au, we really leaned on the understanding that it was a nocturnal bird and that nocturnal birds are named for their sound. This is another good example of having little information on the call, like on this bird. We were really going on a 30-second audio clip that had maybe 2 or 3 distinct call outs in it. And so we spent a good amount of time just kind of listening and trying to repeat the calls to kind of land on that unique sound. And if you have ever been to a bird colony, there's a bunch of different sounds. And so it gets a little confusing sometimes. So, you know, this was a really fun one, but next slide. You can hit play. This one we wanted to highlight because they needed a little bit of investigating to find a name pili to their behavior. But this is examples where, you know, we named these species because of very obvious characteristics for these birds. For the Nunulu, it was one of those urban legends among the seabird community that the annual return of bone-named petrels was really an epic and biblical. Oh, it was really as epic and biblical as the return of mole and ka'upu populations to Hawaii every year. So especially if you're able to witness them, you know, at sunset coming home on those first few days, you know, we really, other than that, we really didn't have a whole lot of information that had them stick out from their cousin counterparts like the ua'u or the ua'ukani. This name didn't take too long for us to get to, for us to reach a consensus that this particular phenomenon of just completely reverberate and just, you know, it was just so numerous, so many birds, it would just blacken the sky. You know, and this video, while it looks like a lot, it really doesn't do the experience justice on how much birds there really are in that video. Conversely, the Palihoa, this name did take a long time, a few years to get through the approval process. The name was proposed by someone who went to Nihoa, saw the birds and gave the name. There was pushback on the grammar of the name, because if Palihoa was meant, Palihoa was proposed to mean Palila and Nihoa as a way to put it together. And it could also be a play on Palihoa, which was a cliff residing companion. This name was set aside, and there was other names offered, but this particular name kept coming back around. And so this is a great example of how names, like poetry, can sometimes transcend or defy rules to express a really authentic and meaningful relationship and understanding to a place or a species, or to an experience. Next slide. This final one we want to talk about is one we got really early on in the process, probably about 2012-ish. There are about 13 or so species given to us early on. Most of these species that we only see 2 of them, because all of them are unpublished, undescribed, which means that they've officially not been categorized. So we only show the 2. At best we knew they don't have any species or genus identifications. And at best, what we know about them is that, they're deep sea bamboo corals. We considered that these depths would not have been known to a Hawaiian worldview through pictures, and yet due to advancing technology, that's how we were able to have some idea of them. We were able to get pictures from the researchers, and I believe the researchers didn't actually go. It was like a RV, unmanned RV, but it was not lost on us the significance and foundational role that corals, sea depths, and Papahanaumokuakea have to the realm of Po, to the deity Kanaloa, and therefore to our livelihood in Hawaii. So we really challenged ourselves with this particular endeavor with these deep sea corals to really find ways to create a name that would stand in both systems of knowledge, as well as as well as having a name that would reinforce a Hawaiian genealogy, even within the science classification systems. So this intention really opened ourselves up to an entirely new horizon. It was, even the researchers had never been that deep or had gone that far before. And so even, so naturally for us, we were also like questioning how a Hawaiian worldview would view those depths. And that was the new horizon we came to. We realized we needed to have a conversation that identified the different vowel or realms of the ocean and the organisms at those depths. We came to some basic understandings of Hawaiian classifications of the ocean. And some of those basic ones is that the ocean is classified horizontally and not vertically, meaning, below the ocean, there was no classifications in a Hawaiian worldview. And so kind of with that understanding, we chose to stay true to that traditional foundation to identify the ocean at those depths horizontally, or, not vertically, basically. Throughout the process, and especially within this corals process, Antipua played a fundamental role in holding us in this space and moving us through it, so we couldn't get stuck or lost in this really wild imagining, of incorporating some new territory into a Hawaiian worldview. So while we were able to land on some names, like you see here, we have the top name is the common Hawaiian name, and the bottom is the proposed science name with the genus and species. We were able to land on some of these names, and we were able to come to some firm ideas that the realm that we're speaking of is a deeply a Kanaloa realm, and that each of these species, corals and animals included, would be considered a representation of Kanaloa. We recognize that there's still a lot of discussion needed to establish this idea of how to classify this in a Hawaiian worldview. Antipua would leave us with pretty much the best advice ever in this process, is to keep it simple, silly. And you know, she played such a big role in this process. And this particular process and conversation with Auntie around these corals happened so early that it really, really helped inform the process that we use today. And it really helped us move along the crafting of a name throughout all of the other ones. So corals was one of the first, but when we moved into birds and limu and plants, we really stuck to kind of this conversation that Auntie kept with us. I think right here is where I want to ask if there's any questions.
Okay, we don't see any questions in the chat,
yeah.
But I do have a question. Are you aware of other Indigenous peoples who are actively perpetuating naming practices?
Oku? Oh, you're mute.
Yeah, so I know that, you know, a lot of Maori communities are perpetuating, and Native American communities are perpetuating the naming practices. As far as like kind of getting familiar with their processes, that's a little new. I know that we've got probably a little bit more background within our larger group of what our, you know, our Polynesian cousins and their naming practices are, but that would be something for us to look into more for sure.
Okay, mahalo.
Mahalo Malia and mahalo Hoku and Hoku.
Yeah.
Hoku,
So
I have one more question for both of you actually. And you mentioned this, Hoku, Cody, a little bit. Could you talk about sort of the ethical space that we encounter when working in this field of naming?
Can you define ethical space?
Or I guess the kuleana that's attached to working with Hawaiian knowledge and Hawaiian places and all the work that you folks are doing. What are the principles and values that are associated to this work, perhaps even beyond ethics? It's big,
really, huh? Yeah, it's kind of a big question, but I guess I'll take a crack at it unless you want to start, Hoku.
You go. Oh, I'm not on mute. Okay. You go first and then I'll see what, because I had an idea. Go for it.
Go for it. So, you know, it's not lost on us that, you know, naming these species that are quote unquote, I mean, the technical term is undescribed, but for non-science folks, we just say newly discovered. So, you know, that they're not, you know, official or anything, but, you know, it's really not lost on us that not only is it new species, but that where we're naming them from, that they come from Papahanaumokuakea. They come from, you know, the Aina Akua. They, like Hoku was saying, they are where our, you know, our children come from, and they're where our kupuna, you know, our kupuna reside, as well as, you know, where we go to when we pass. So it's really nothing short of just like bringing your best, as well as it's really important to dig deeply in both worlds of you know, having a really cultivating a deep relationship to place, as well as deep relationship to just Hawaiian values and practices, alongside, you know, actively participating in the current standards of protection and conservation and management. So it's really just trying to balance both worlds, and then on top of that, make it in an environment where it's really inviting for other people to want to ask us to name these things, because, you know, it's not, there's nothing written in stone that these researchers and managers are required to ask us to give these names. We're really, like Hoku was saying early on, is that some of this, you know, we're really doing this to reinforce and kind of reestablish our spaces again. And you do that initially with a name. And on top of that, we also acknowledge that this kind of naming is not the same as naming a keiki or naming a, you know, naming a canoe, you know, or a boat. This is, you know, and a lot of instances with keiki, you know, when you're naming a keiki in a Hawaiian worldview, you can draw upon your dream and be like, okay, my dream said this, and so therefore that keiki that was the keiki talking to me. And in some instances, we really are trying to let the place tell us what, you know, what it is, or the species tell us what they, you know, who they are. And sometimes we don't have all the information. So ethically, you know, when the discussions become too twisted into, like, you know, we go down roads where it can get confusing, we really just fall back on grounding ourselves in how important this work is. And so we pause, we'll call another meeting later or something like that. And so I guess in short, it's a full-time it's a full-time you know, commitment to Papahanaumokuakea and all of that stuff. And the nomenclature is really just a part of that. Because none of us are really, it's not our career, you know, the nomenclature group. It's actually all of us being called and asked to serve in that capacity willingly, you know, and then turn around and then go back and do our work that we do throughout there. But I think that's a good way to explain a complicated situation.
Yeah.
Maikai mahalo.
So we did, so yeah, we had, so in closing, like just after Hoku had gone through all of, you know, exemplifying the different names that we've given, the processes and the steps and the ways that we come about these names, I think the things that were important for us, we were really thinking about during this presentation, the importance of, you know, what we want to leave you with, and this understanding, and throughout our conversation, like Hoku keeps bringing up, you know, there's so many things. It's such a rich conversation of such diverse backgrounds and peoples coming in that it really evokes a lot of exciting, just new ideas and ways of being together. So some of the closing thoughts that I wanted to just share was just thoughts from our Nomenclature Hui and larger cultural working group. And one of them is that these names and their histories and meanings will be established to ensure that Native Hawaiian names are imbued with appropriate cultural authority and officially recognized in government records. So those are one of our goals and things that we aim to go towards. And we also want to continue to advocate for these names and these species and these places, as well as continue to build, grow, and evolve our relationships from the past and into our future. And we feel that through these collaborative efforts, we have more opportunity for community, inspiring and enriching this process as we continue to further and perpetuate these practices. So, you know, as we talk about this naming process, it's personal, it's collective, it's collaborative, and it helps strengthens why we do what we do. You know, as researchers and educators and community members, we can get lost in the daily to-dos of what our jobs and our lives require. But when we take a step back and we look at the things, like Hoku was saying, we love to be in these conversations. It's not our jobs, it's just our passions, Kalani and all of us. And taking a step back and breathing and giving that time and space to contribute to conversations like that is meaningful, enriching, and adds that momona, that stuff that we love. So yeah. And I don't know, Hoku, if you want to close with anything more with that, but I think that was the most important. The mechanics of the naming process is there, but the momona, the fat and the juice is all in the conversation and the relationships that we have with each other.
Yeah, just really mahalo. I think that, you know, it can't be overstated how much the people who are involved in the conversation, as well as the discussions during that time, really, really do shape the names that are given, and the conversations and people that are involved. Man, they're just amazing, amazing people. I mean, I'm not always in all the meetings or anything like that. I kept, you know, I say we, but it's not always just, you know, me in the whole thing. But the group of people that are part of this is, you know, there's a lot of people involved. You saw those two pictures of the genealogy of the cultural working group and nomenclature, and that's not even everybody. And some of those people, some people who have contributed to names aren't even in those pictures. And so it's really, really a big process. As well as the other, I think the final thing I want to say is, you know, I think what I'm trying to get to is that, you know, mai maka'u in, you know, in naming things, you know, that you already do out, you know, in your practices, name it for yourself, you know, use a Hawaiian name, try it out, and try doing that process, because the truth is, you know, when we make it easy, you know, the name says more, is said more, and we remember those species. A lot of these species we give names to, some that are newly discovered, and some are really threatened and critically endangered. And so when you speak their names, you really ho'omana them, and you really kind of give them that one more chance to, you know, to kind of be enlivened again in our everyday consciousness. They're so, you know, a lot of these species, especially Papahanaumokuakea, is so far away from everybody. And thanks to Kekuewa, you know, Dr. Kekuewa Kikiloi, he found, you know, the old Hawaiian names, and to prove that the old Hawaiian names of Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, Papahanaumokuakea, to prove that, you know, we didn't always have to go out there, but we remembered these places through names. It was because of that, you know, we were able to unlock so much more of our understanding. And so what's in a name, a lot is in a name, you know, a lot. And so, you know, just mai maka'u i ka olelo, don't be afraid to use Hawaiian to find, you know, to craft a name, and, you know, for the things you do, or, you know, whatnot, just eola, you know.
I just met somebody here from the Kumash tribe. Like, yeah, in the chat room. It's like, I want to hear their language. Nice. So yeah, folks, we're open for questions. We're happy to go back through any of the names and talk about them a little bit more if you like. Yeah, I keep seeing some stuff coming up. Oh, wow. I wonder if these guys have canoes. Ooh, they built, sorry, I'm in the chat room. And this guy builds canoes. Right. Well, and it was crazy. I'll just say it out loud because he or she could probably hear me. When I was in Long Beach, I met a woman who was from a Native American tribe, and she was displaying her canoe at it was a SACNAS conference, and her canoe was so beautiful. I never knew there was a tribe connected to where I grew up, and that they were Va'a people. And I was like, this is so wonderful. So he just said in the chat that there's Va'a people over there too. Well, you see, sorry.
So we have another question. Here it's talking about extending Kalani's ninau regarding ethics and giving names to scientific discoveries. How is the cultural working group nomenclature committee's process similar or different to that used in astronomy? Good question.
I'm not familiar with the astronomy naming process. Is it just like the scientific naming process?
Eric? Eric, would you like to unmute yourself and maybe be able to answer that?
Oh, aloha. I don't know anything about I just know that they often go to Uncle Larry. Aloha, guys.
Oh, hi.
But just really trying to navigate this idea of, I thought what I heard in Kalani's question regarding the ethics was, you know, the deep pilina that you guys are describing, right, is not simply just assigning Hawaiian names to objects that are being found in the universe from telescopes on top of, you know, our Mauna, right? And so I don't know anything about their process. I just wanted to listen to whether members of this committee had knowledge regarding that, and you know, whether or not there were comments on that process.
That's interesting. Yeah, we've never had anyone from, mahalo Eric for asking that question. We've never had anyone from the astronomy department or from that realm actually reach out to us. But it would be something that this method we could apply to if that was an interest. Like Hoku was saying, we're often brought different things that don't have a lot of information or are very far away from us or in realms that we will never access. And so this methodology is designed to kind of help, you know, evoke those names without being able to be in that space. As far as the ethics, one thing that you brought up, I think when I was hearing Hoku talking and Kalani asking that question, I think overall the sense of reciprocity and acknowledging the different methods that are used helps strengthen and understand how we behave ethically and respectfully with each other by honoring each other's practices. So as we come together as researchers and scientists or practitioners, you know, that I think is a very at the forefront of how we engage with each other, respecting that there are very formal structures in creating a name if we want to go scientific method, but then, you know, we have our ways of doing things that are our ways, and that's just as valuable and meaningful as implementing a scientific name. Now, blending the two methods together, we, like what Hoku was talking about, the corals were a good example of trying to come up with a scientific naming method or way that we would implement, or, you know, how would we create a scientific name from Hawaiian ike, mana'o, and hana and such. And so that was a very deep conversation that really evoked, you know, requires a lot more discussion, but we did come to a way of creating our scientific naming process that resulted in what we produced. But I think ethically overall, it's just simply said is that that reciprocity of respect and understanding of each other's space.
I'll jump in and add a little. I think that the astronomy community, I think they, through UH, I'm not entirely sure the entire process, but because they reached to Uncle, Kumulale, Kimura, and also through Imiloa, there's, you know, Hawaiians there. But as far as formality, the nomenclature committee is part of a subcommittee, is part of a advice, you know, it's kind of a couple ticks down from an advisory council. And whether there's an advisory council that astronomy community leans on that is specifically for giving Hawaiian names, I'm not entirely sure, but I know that they do reach out and ask for Hawaiian names. And I would assume that the Hawaiians, such as Larry Kimura, does take as much consideration and intention in crafting a name as we do, although the method might be different. And another part of the ethic question I wanted to touch on was that, especially in areas where people are able to go and we're asking to be named species in those spaces, sometimes in the discussion, you know, it's not lost on us that we, in order to actually be a really meaningful name, we do need to experience all 6 senses in that space. And so sometimes to just be given one picture kind of reduces us into like, kind of already contorts our ability to truly give a real, like full-blown, fully realized Hawaiian name. I remember just the question reminded me of Uncle Saul Koho'ohalahala in one of our choral discussions, kind of looking at a photo and kind of asking us just blankly if any of us had ever been below 100 feet of water, you know, what that felt like. And, you know, so in some ways, the nomenclature process in Papahanaumokuakea, kind of due to the management structure itself, that OHA is a co-trustee equal to the other agents, it does afford us a little bit more of a ability to propose Hawaiian names in a more authentic way, albeit sometimes we're not on the research vessel or in the dive expedition. The ability to participate in the process from beginning to end is a little different in Papahanaumokuakea than it is in the astronomy community. Save for some instances like deep sea corals where we were given pictures and we were like, okay, I think we want to go down there. Can we go? You know, like we want to be the ones going down and checking it out and coming back and saying, hey, you know, we have this name. But I think that because of the management structure itself, that OHA is up there, it does afford us a little bit of more of a participation than throughout the process than say astronomy. And I hope that kind of answered some of it. Yeah.
Oh, mahalo nui. To Hoku Pihana, Hoku Cody, we so mahalo you for joining us this evening and sharing your ike and your mana'o. And we just really appreciate both of you being here this evening. For those of you who would love to watch this again, which I would, yeah, I'm going to watch this presentation again. This and future webinars will be archived at the Hanauma Bay Education Program's YouTube page. And Gavin has also posted his email for those of you if you have any questions. So coming up next week as we continue our Mahina Olelo Hawaii series, next week's presentation will feature Sheldon Rosa and Ariel Blacklow as they present Nanaike Kumu, exploring cultural dimensions of marine species in the Hawaiian archipelago. So come join us next week.
Oh, it's Sheldon. I'll be there. Are you going to be at hula, Sheldon? Wait, what is today? Thursday. You better go hula.
Okay, Sheldon, you got the word.
Sheldon. Nice.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, for having us.
We just want to close this evening's wonderful presentation and sharing of Ike and Aloha with Meleno Papahanaumokuakea, which was composed by Kainani Kahaunaile and Hale Aloha Ayau. So mahalo to all of you for joining us. Malama lama kala nuiaka ne pukaiha eha e. Apa kau ke kukunai ka ilikai o nā kaiwalu. He ike makavalu ka ue ano inei o nā au valo kanaloa au nā vela no hoi ka moana nui. He hua kai ka makani ole hua au ike kai. Ku ono ka lua o ku hei moana ike kapa e hukai o ka ulei. O ku i ka lolu ulua e ke aloha no ni hoa moku manu. Manu o ku i ka ahui he alaka ina ka lahui. O hina pu koa, o hina pu hala koa, o hina kupu kupu, o hina i ka malamai. Hua ka o hua lu'u ke kola aloha ka hili mukala. Kia I ka a kalano iu ka. Hanau ka pea puka ka pea pea I ke kai. E ina I ka ina. Ono I ka huna o ka paakai. Mano mano ka I ke liu o ka hopo o ka naloi. Ko I lua hai no ka lehu lehu. O ku uluhi. Hano hano vale ka aina kupuna o na mokule I. No Papahanaumokuakea la he no. Ai. Eola, ka olelo Hawaiʻi. Mahalo, mahalo, Navahine. Mahalo all of you for joining us this evening. Aloha, ahui ho.
Yep. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's Hanama Talks presentation, and hope you guys can make it next week, Thursday on the 18th, same time, 6:30. And you guys all have a great night. Thank you all for speakers for tonight, and aloha.
Aloha, mahalo nui.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Mahalo, hoku, mahalo, hoku.